Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'll start with a clarification about parts of my previous podcast when I was very critical of the lack of spine our political leaders demonstrate in their dealings with the United States, and I'll give a further example of that in just a moment. A few people contacted me with the message, well, what do you realistically expect them to do? To which I have two words, Mark Carney. The Prime Minister of Canada is pushing back and has clearly further enraged Trump, who is once again threatening to destroy the country using very violent language, saying he will impose a 100% tariff on Canadian goods if they sign a large trade deal with China. And I'll come back to that in the context of Trump being forced to drop his outrageous threats to occupy Greenland for completely fabricated national security reasons. You know, this total nonsense about Greenland facing Russian and Chinese invasion. By the way, people should feel free to contact me if there's anything in these podcasts they disagree with. My details are online. I welcome sensible discussions about these things. Anonymous abuse is not something I'm into because that is typically done by men who beat their wives and like hurting small children. But on any other basis, feel free to contact me. Now, Carney has said relations with the United States are being ruptured, and it's not a transition. And he is absolutely correct. Anyway, back to Australian politicians and their spinelessness. That, by the way, is not a partisan observation. Members of the coalition, with one very interesting exception, who I'll get to in a moment, also routinely tug the forelock and grovel and scrape on anything connected with US alliance issues. And just as the Labor Party is dominated by factional hacks, the situation with the coalition is similar, with plenty of people going from university into a Liberal minister's office, or at best a Liberal-aligned law firm, before being parachuted into a safe seat. Also, there are some good politicians, but they are now in the minority. Two of the better performing ministers, I thought, in the first Albanese government were Ed Husic and Mark Dreyfus, the latter who I know reasonably well. But of course they were both axed by factional hacks led by Richard Marles. The Prime Minister could have intervened, but didn't, which I think reflects very poorly on his character, as it also does on Marles, the assassination in chief. But back to national security in the US alliance, and I'll begin with something that might sound a bit trivial, namely Donald Trump's outrageous sledging of NATO's contribution to the war in Afghanistan, saying that other countries avoided any fighting. Now, Trump is too stupid to know that more than NATO was involved. It was a coalition of 51 nations, including Australia. And I remember this well, being at the big ISAF headquarters and base at Kabul International Airport in 2011 and seeing those 51 flags on the walls of the huge mess every morning. I was there not as a guest of the Australian Army, who wouldn't want to have anything to do with the likes of me, but with the French, whose forces were frequently engaged in heavy clashes in the nearby Sorobi Valley. And it was during that visit that I learned a lot about Tiger armed reconnaissance helicopters and why I'm still appalled at the decision of the Australian Army to retire our 22 of them 15 years early and replace them with $7 billion worth of Apache helicopters from the US. But that might be a story for another day. And one of the largest groups I hung out with at Kabul, apart from my French hosts, were the Danes, who had a large number of troops there. Now, they were all very friendly guys and girls, very professional, and I hope all of them made it safely home, because 44 of them did not. That's a fraction less than Australia's 47 dead, but since Denmark only has a population of 4 million, their losses were proportionately much higher. So let's get back to Trump and children. Close your ears for 5 seconds. to Trump pouring a bucket of shit on all the non-Americans who died or were wounded or traumatized. And remember, it was all of the NATO countries and others that came to the aid of the United States after the Twin Tower 9/11 terrorist attacks. Oh, and by the way, I mentioned ISAF. That stands for International Security Assistance Force, which was the UN-mandated umbrella for the operation. And people might like to know, and you won't see this anywhere in the mainstream media, the US Secretary of War, and what a sad joke that title is, as well as the person holding it, Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News weekend presenter who's covered in Christian nationalist tattoos, well, Mr. Hegseth has been loudly telling people in Washington that ISAF actually stands for I Saw Americans Fight. So, Australians, next time you find yourself slobbering all over Hegseth's boots, you might like to keep in mind his view, which undoubtedly would have delighted Trump, that Australians were mere spectators while it was the big, brave Americans who did the actual fighting. What a disgrace. So, how have countries reacted? Well, with outrage, of course. The UK Prime Minister Kier Starmer demonstrated for him a small amount of spine by calling Trump's comments outrageous. He called Trump and demanded an apology, which in a way he in fact received. But what did Australia's brave politicians do? I saw that Defence Minister Richard Marles used social media to put out a short statement about the bravery of Australians in Afghanistan, but of course he couldn't bring himself to actually mention Trump or the US. If anyone had read it who hasn't been following this closely, they would have thought, WTF? Why is the Defence Minister issuing a statement about Afghanistan and the bravery of Australian soldiers? We all know they were brave. Now, similarly, I mentioned previously how our equally brave Prime Minister managed to twist himself into pretzels over the US invasion of Venezuela by amazingly not mentioning the US or Trump at all in his official reaction. Clearly, the PMO, that's the Prime Minister's office, has issued an edict saying no one is to ever directly criticise the US ever. And as for the Prime Minister himself, what did he say about this slur? He didn't actually issue a statement at all, but when questioned by a journalist, replied, without naming Trump, that Trump's comments were inappropriate. Inappropriate. Wow. Such courage, such fortitude, such strength in standing up for Australian soldiers. I think it's pathetic. And by the way, I'm recording this on Australia Day. Now, I mentioned that there's one person on the opposition side of things who does stand up to the US, and that's Andrew Hastie, who said, and I'll quote directly, this is in response to slandering Australian soldiers, Hastie said, "One of the most important things in building coalitions and alliances is mutual respect, and a really important virtue in a leader is restraint. President Trump, by dumping on allied troops, has shown neither." Well said, Mr. Hastie, who has done the decent thing, unlike either our Prime Minister or Defence Minister, who abjectly cower in terror at the prospect of saying anything, no matter how trivial, that could be interpreted as a negative comment about the Trump administration. Now, interestingly, about a year ago, Andrew Hastie, a former soldier with a distinguished service record, also very mildly and politely said the time has come for the US relationship to be re-examined to see if its structure is still in the best interests of Australia. And that comment, by the way, was echoed by the axed Science Minister Ed Husic. But so in thrall of the US are the government's national security leadership team that you won't hear a word of criticism. Now, speaking of which, I noticed Greg Moriarty, the current Defence Department Secretary, will replace Kevin Rudd as our next ambassador to Washington. He's an uncontroversial choice, though, as I said last week, I would have preferred Richard Marles to go, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, he is an exceptionally good licker of US boots and would therefore fit into the Washington scene. I mean, he's truly exceptional in that behaviour, none better. Too bad there isn't a prize or an award. And the second thing is it would get him out of defence. If that happened, that would see Pat Conroy taking over the portfolio, and at least with him, there's some hope that media questions would be answered, unlike the close to 100% suppression of Richard Marles. And by the way, Pat Conroy is doing most of the work for the portfolio anyway, and that would clear someone else to be elevated to the defence industry portfolio. And wouldn't it be nice if someone competent like Husick came back in, but the factions would never allow something so sensible to happen, and the Prime Minister doesn't have the character to push for it? As it happens, I was going to reference Mr. Moriarty in any case, because during the week I watched an interview with him conducted by the organisation CSIS. That's the very authoritative think tank, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, where he smilingly said the relationship with America was wonderful and we, Australia, could take heart from the recent national security strategy which cemented the US role in Asia. It's a bit ironic that he was speaking to CSIS since defence and the government hate Australian think tanks, and in a future podcast I'll explain why. They also hate the veterans community, and they also hate the media. Now, this idea expressed by Mr. Moriarty, echoing the view of the government, it's this sort of delusional thinking that completely dominates the Australian security space. The document, the National Security Strategy, doesn't guarantee anything because US actions are those of a completely rogue nation, as increasing numbers of countries realise, but sadly not Australia. Our politicians are basically urging Australians not to believe the evidence of their own eyes. Now, as usual, I'm running a bit short on time because I really want to say a few things about Trump changing his mind on acquiring Greenland, possibly by force, and once again having it in for Canada. How can Australia possibly continue to rely on the US, which also, by the way, is ripping itself apart internally with US government agencies killing US citizens and then brazenly lying about it? How can we count on them as a trusted ally? Those days are over. Trump caved on Greenland. He arrived at the Davos Economic Forum in Switzerland, obviously planning to fling his weight around, demonstrating once again that he was all-powerful, but he left with his tail between his legs. And that happened, he withdrew the threat to acquire Greenland, saying that the framework of a future deal had been arrived at, no details available. And that happened for three basic reasons. The stock market fell, and there were also parallel problems with the bond market. Secondly, there was pushback from a few Republicans who are showing signs of growing a spine. And third, most obviously, a united but belated pushback from the Europeans with Kier Starmer, Emmanuel Macron of France, and Giorgia Meloni of Italy, and others, all saying no, N-O, it's not going to happen. And another interesting little thing, on top of all of that, all of the European right-wing and neo-Nazi parties also said no to the US occupation of Greenland. Those parties like Germany's AfD, that creepy Vice President J.D. Vance said the Trump administration would be supporting. And by the way, I'm just waiting for that doctrine to be applied to Australia, when presumably Vance and Trump start supporting one nation. I almost hope that happens, just to see Albo and Marles trying to spin their way out of that one with the usual pro-US, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Now, I'm almost out of time, but everyone should read Carney's speech at the Davos Summit, which called for middle powers to get together. It's a call that should be resonating in Australia. Now, interestingly, Jim Chalmers, our treasurer, was there, and he's been reported as being very positive about Carney's speech. And he said it was generating thoughts inside the government. Well, I actually doubt that, or if people in the government are rethinking about relations with the US, it won't be Albo, Miles, or Penny Wong. If you can't defend the record of Australian soldiers in a proper, direct way, not using weasel words and evasion, I suggest you get another job. Now, I'm going to come back to Andrew Hastie, not because I want this podcast to be boosting or supporting his political fortunes. He can do that on his own. I've met him a couple of times. I don't know him well, but he is clearly a future leader of the opposition. It looks like it's between him and Angus Taylor. If the Liberal Party wants to select the smarter person, they'll go for Hastie. He's articulate. He's personable. He served in the Australian Army for many years. He deployed to Afghanistan. It's also clear that he has an ethical framework because he was prepared to testify against Ben Roberts-Smith when many other ethical and moral pygmies within the army refused to do so. So there's something of substance there, I think. Now, the other interesting part of the dynamic, of course, would be if he did become leader of the opposition and continued down the path to be critical of Trump and to be expressing skepticism about certain aspects of the US relationship. I wonder how Labor would react. I wonder how Miles, Albo and Wong would cope, because none of them have served in the military. None of them have a particularly good natural grasp or affinity with defence and military matters. So I think it would put them in a very, very awkward position, somehow being able to respond to Hastie. They could hardly accuse him of being unpatriotic. He's demonstrated that over and over again. Wearing the Australian uniform, he has risked his life. None of that lot have. So they'd have to proceed with a great deal of caution. And it might just help open up this debate a little bit into the nature of the US relationship. Now, I also read on the weekend in that organ of the Communist Party, The Guardian, the Australian version, an article by Zoe Daniels, one of the Teal Independents and a very good former ABC journalist, I might say. And Zoe Daniels also very clearly, calmly and articulately said, referencing Trump's bizarre, erratic, threatening behaviour, said, clearly the time has come to look at the relationship. We can no longer trust the United States and we have to be making alternate arrangements. Well, good on you as well, Zoe. We've now got at least one person in the Liberal Party. We've got independents. I know privately a few people in the Labor Party, not many, and they're cowered, of course, into total silence out of fear of being, not promoted or left off lucrative parliamentary committees, that sort of thing. But at least there are tiny little signs that the dam might be breaking. It can't happen too soon. And I'll just finish with a bit of speculation about the kidnapping of Venezuela's President Maduro, a total creep, deserves to be out of office, deserves to be in jail. I'll say all of that. A theory in the United States is that Trump is leaning on him via his lawyers to agree that he, Maduro, was the head of an international conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 US presidential election, which, of course, Trump lies about and claims that he's won by a landslide. Now, this, people are connecting the dots. If it's true, and I don't know if it is, all that I'm doing is saying that this is being widely reported in the United States, it's Trump once again setting up the scene to not go in 2028, using the argument, well, I should have legitimately been there between 2020 and 2024. Biden was there illegally, and therefore I'm entitled to a third term on that basis. Scary food for thought. this is the world we live in. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.